the Muslim Ummah. And each day that goes by, the harder we try. In gratitude we pray to Allah. Chosen as part of the best of mankind, we spread the word of Islam. Every difficulty faced in our life makes us realize that it's just part of Allah's plan. Feeling stronger, we take it in our stride.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to episode number 8 of our exciting journey through Islamic history. And mashallah, we have reached already we have seen already quite some important facts, and we have gone through a lot of countries, mashallah. We have gone through North Africa, we have gone through Asia, and now we're actually still stuck in Asia because, mashallah, the biggest continent, the most important one for Islam, definitely. The biggest population in the world is in countries in Asia. We discussed Indonesia last time, and now we are moving on to the biggest country with regards to population in Asia, and this is, of course, China. MashaAllah. I'm Dr. Stef Keris, the author of The Forgotten Ottoman Heritage in Europe, the editor-in-chief of ilmonlinemag.com, and the lecturer in several universities in Europe and in Africa. And I had the chance to, alhamdulillah, travel throughout these communities. And some of these countries I visited myself, many of them actually, not just many of them. And I had the chance to bring back some of the pictures and photographs that I have made there myself, some of the coverage that I could get with me myself, mashallah, which was exciting, interesting, and I would do it anytime again. China, massive country, the biggest population in the world, not the biggest Muslim population, but because it has the biggest population, 100 million Muslims is a tiny minority in that part of the world. In China, a tiny minority. But we are talking about a number of most probably between 40, 50 and 80 million, maybe even if we are lucky, maybe 100 million Muslims in China. MashaAllah, as I said, again, for our understanding, for looking at the Arabs nowadays, so looking at Turks and so on, 100 million is basically on the level of any other Muslim nation. But for China, 100 million doesn't mean anything. 60 million, 70, 80, 90, 100 million is not a big number. But for us as Muslims, it is a number to consider. If we look at the history of China, of course, and Islam in China, we have to realize that, as many people don't know, Islam in China was not imported by some Arabs and not in the 20th century or 19th century or whatever. No. It was there from the very beginning of the growth of Islam. Already in 618, Islam was present in China. Already in the time of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, actually, there was Islam spreading in China. It's incredible, isn't it? If you just consider that it was still spreading in the Arabian Peninsula, and it had already reached China, it had already reached such a massive and important country in Asia, and the rest of Asia, of course. Now, how did it go to China? The maternal uncle of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself, who was that? Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas. He was the one who was sent out with his first journey already. He made at least 3 journeys to China that are known, and the first one was the one where Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas was sent out to China basically and had the chance to meet with the rulers and the emperor of that area where he went to in China, and he had the chance to convey the message, mashallah. Now, he was in that way, in our understanding, he was the ambassador of Islam. He was also the ambassador of the developing Arabian Peninsula, of course. So politically also, he played a very important role. When Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas was sent, he obviously didn't go alone. He took with him quite some people who also had an influence on their surrounding, and people in China had the chance to observe and understand Islam and look at these people, how they were performing basically Islam and what Islam meant to them. It was, of course, for them something totally different. Again, like in India, the Muslims had to deal with Hindus mainly. In China, they dealt with Buddhists and several other religions which are indigenous in that part of the world. And most of them could not, it was not like the Ahl al-Kitab, the Christians or the Jews, who would see the understanding or who would have the understanding of one God, who is our creator, who is the creator of the universe. But they saw things in a different way, in a different light, so that the Muslim communities in China as well as in India had to unfortunately separate a bit from the rest of their society because they were in that way quite different. But again, people accepted Islam not because of any outside power in that way, no, willingly. The Tang dynasty was a dynasty that actually allowed Muslims to propagate Islam and allowed Muslims to give through Islam, alhamdulillah. The Tang emperor was also the one who ordered the construction of the memorial mosque in Canton, the first mosque in the country, in memory of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the first masjid was built during that time, during the 7th century, during the time that Islam was spreading in the Arabian Peninsula. During the same time, the first mosque in Canton was built as well. And during the same time that Islam was spreading in the Arabian Peninsula, it was also spreading in Asia. Amazing, isn't it? I mean, these are amazing facts here, mashallah. We have to remember, we have to realize that the same moment that the Arabs, some Arabs had not accepted Islam yet, whereas in China or in Southeast Asia, there were already Asians who were already bowing down to Allah, alhamdulillah. Amazing, amazing. There are a lot of, what shall we call them? There are differences of opinion in the way of how old really Islam. In general, you can say that everybody agrees, every historian agrees that Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas was in China indeed, and not only once, but at least 3 times, and that he was the ambassador of Islam and helped Islam to spread in that area, no doubt about it, and that in the 7th century already Islam was spreading in that part of the world. But again, there are no exact dates where exactly where the first Muslims and the first Muslim community and so on and so on. It's difficult to trace them back. It's very difficult to have some accurate and authentic information. As I mentioned before, the Tang dynasty, the first dynasty, basically the dynasty that was ruling during the time of the spread of Islam in the 7th century up to the 10th century even, that dynasty had a cosmopolitan, was a cosmopolitan dynasty, was a cosmopolitan culture. They had contacts with Central Asia, had contacts with traders from outside of Asia even, and were in contact with Muslims from Central Asia, from the Arabian Peninsula, from even Africa. They were in contact with these traders, and they gave basically, they were quite open to receive outside influence, and they were open to receive something different in that way. Islam was, of course, very different to the Chinese. They allowed also Central and Western Asian merchants to reside in China, in Chinese cities, which allowed, again, the spread of Islam even more so. The first major Muslim settlement in China consisted of Arab and Persian merchants. Again, as we said in the last episodes, we looked at Iran and we looked at the way that the Iranians, the Persians, conveyed Islam. They went into Central Asia. Many of them were traders and were business people and merchants. Many of them went also to China, and they were the first ones to settle in the bigger Chinese cities. And convey the message of Islam. Not only the Arabs, but also the Persians, which of course again pushed the Persian language a bit further. As we said, it played even a bigger role than Arabic in the Central Asian republics. The Tang dynasty that we have been discussing the whole time, was very open to foreign traders and merchants and allowed them to settle, as we said. They especially settled in the port cities, of course, and in the bigger cities where they had to deal with tradespeople, of course, and merchants. In port cities such as Guangzhou, Guangzhou and Huangzhou, these are all cities were in China's southeastern seaboard. Now, over there, basically, the Muslims had also had the chance to convey the message, and that's where they got most of the converts, most of the people who accepted Islam, alhamdulillah, during that time. Guangzhou alone is home to 4 mosques, including the famous Huasheng Mosque, believed to have been built by Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas. Now, if we look at that, now look at how far back Islam goes in China, and people don't even realize that. Many people don't understand that China was played an important role for the Asian history of Islam and for the world history of Islam. It's not only, as we discussed before, Indonesia, simply because it is, of course, the biggest nation, Muslim nation in the world, but China has such a big minority, such a big Muslim minority, that cannot be left aside. And of course the history plays a role. And we should not forget that in China, it's not only in a specific area as people might think, in the Xinjiang province, in the north and in the northeast of China, where we would have Turkish and Turkic tribes, okay, that had settled there. They are Muslims until nowadays, are not ethnic Chinese, but we do have ethnic Chinese, as we just said, who had accepted Islam long before already. Throughout the country, we will find Muslim communities. Even in cities like Beijing and Shanghai, we will find quite big Muslim minorities, mashallah. Now, in the very same city, Guangzhou, in the very same city that we discussed before, there is also the grave, is believed to be the grave of Ibn Abi Waqqas, the father of Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, the city of Guangzhou, as we said before. It is interesting that all these Islamic elements can be still found in China, especially after the revolution. We will talk about it, inshallah, after the communists came to power. Islam and any religion was considered bad and was considered having a bad influence on the people and on the revolution. During the Tang dynasty, during this time that we're discussing up to the 10th century, during the Tang dynasty, Islam was brought to China by Arab and Persian traders. They were primarily concerned with trading and commerce and not with propagating Islam, definitely not. But, as Allah wants it, of course, if we are honest in our trade and everything, and people see that we have a good character and that we are good people, basically, mashallah, people will understand that this deen is the only deen, and that's the deen of Allah. And we'll go further into the next dynasties that are still coming in China after the break, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
We are the Muslim Ummah, and each day that goes by, the harder we try. In gratitude we pray to Allah.
Welcome to Tech Talk. I'm your host, Omar Shear. This season of Tech Talk, we will focus specifically on the internet.
A student would type their paper, and instead of handing me a hard copy of their paper, they would upload it to this learning system, this e-learning system.
I have some great experience when it comes to technology, and in particular, internet technology. Call to action is something that we do in our day-to-day lives, and maybe we don't realize it. Now we want to discuss, after you have a product and you have a website and you have a way to communicate with your customers, which would be your email marketing system, now it's time to take the money from the customer.
the Muslim Ummah. And each day that goes by, the harder we try. In gratitude we pray to Allah.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome back again after the break. Now, we are in the wonderful country of China. Now, we have realized until now that Islam went the same time that it was spreading in the Arabian Peninsula, it was also spreading in China. And not only in China, but also in the rest of Asia. And we discussed before Central Asia, we discussed Southeast Asia, we looked into Indonesia, Malaysia. Now China, it plays an important role. We should not forget the importance that China has nowadays in the perspective. And if we look at the world nowadays, world history, economics, we look at China and we see a giant in front of us. As well as India. We discussed India before. These are countries in Asia that are and will be playing a very important role for the future generations, definitely. And that's why it is important to realize that in these countries, both of them, there are massive Muslim minorities living, and these Muslim minorities were there since the beginning of Islam and did not come into these areas from outside in that way of immigration or whatever, but they were there already, and they were indigenous people, and there are indigenous people living in both countries that we discussed. And China plays an important role simply because for the Chinese people, 100 million, let's say if there are 100 million Chinese Muslims, is not a big minority in consideration. If you look at the population of China, population of China is nearly 1.7 billion. Now 100 million Muslims is not really a big number. But for us as Muslims and the rest of the world, we look at 100 million Chinese Muslims, and this is of course quite a number we cannot disregard. We talked about the Tang dynasty, where Islam basically settled, and where Islam and the Muslims settled in the big port cities in China, and where the Muslims who came from the Arabian Peninsula and from Persia, they were the ones who brought Islam to China and settled there basically. Some of them married, of course, Chinese women. Their families became Muslim families, and that's how the growth of Islam also went further, alhamdulillah. Now, the next dynasty that we have to consider is the Song dynasty. So after the Tang dynasty, the Song dynasty, 10th, 11th century onwards, by the time that the Song dynasty took over, Muslims had come to play a major role in the import and export industry of the country. The office of Director General of Shipping was consistently held by a Muslim during this period. In 1070, the Song Emperor Shenzong invited 5,300 Muslim men from Bukhara. They settled in China in order to create a buffer zone between the Chinese and the Liao Empire in the northeast. Later on, these men were settled between the Song capital of Kaifeng and Yanqing, which is modern-day Beijing. Modern-day Beijing. As we said before the break, we mentioned that the Chinese Muslims are not just in a specific area, as we are made to believe nowadays, just in Xinjiang, in the northeast of China. No, they're not only there. There are specific Turkic tribes that had accepted Islam, and they are there. That's right. But we just saw that there are quite a big population, or a number of Muslims living in areas such as Beijing. Nowadays, if you go to China, and it is really fantastic, amazing, whoever has a chance to go and visit that country, they should go and do that. And if you go to Beijing, if you go to Shanghai, if you go to the bigger cities, there is no doubt about you being able to find Muslims, Muslim communities there, being able to eat Chinese halal food, and it is really a great experience being in China among the Muslim Chinese, mashallah. I myself had the chance to go to Hong Kong. Hong Kong, of course, simply because it was a British colony until recently, its history is a little bit different to the rest of China, but in Hong Kong, you have the chance to discover at least 5 different mosques, 4 or 5 different masajid, mosques, and you will find quite a big Muslim community there as well. During the Song dynasty, it is important to mention the Mongols. It's important to mention the importance of the Mongol-founded Yuan dynasty. The Yuan dynasty between 1271 and 1368. During that dynasty, large numbers of Muslims settled in China. Now, it's amazing, isn't it? The Mongols were not Muslims at that time. Now, they themselves were a minority in China. They themselves. And they actually gave foreign immigrants, such as the Muslims, such as the Christians from Europe, such as Jews from West Asia, they gave them an elevated status over the native Han Chinese as part of the governing strategy. This meant that giving Muslims a heavy influence gave them also more power. So this Mongol-founded Yuan dynasty allowed the Muslims to have more power, not only the Muslims, but among all the others, also the Muslims to have more power than the native Han Chinese. Hundreds of thousands of Muslim immigrants were recruited and forcibly relocated from Western and Central Asia by the Mongols to help them administer the rapidly expanding empire. The Mongols used Persian, Arab, and Uyghur administrators, generally known as Semu, which meant various eye color. Imagine, if you look at Chinese, of course, they look very different to the Arab, Peninsula Arabs, or to people coming from Persia, and they gave them certain names to distinguish them from the Chinese. So these people were there to act as officers of taxation and finance. If we look at this career step, you can call it clearly a step in career of the Muslims, we can see that as a minority in China, they played a massive role. They played an important role, and people in China, I'm sure, we don't have authentic sources, this is me not talking, I'm sure that because of their position, there might have been also envy and there might have been jealousy going on. And not only for the Muslims, but I'm sure that also the others who were preferred by the Mongols, they were given special positions that might also have created hatred by the indigenous, by the Han Chinese especially. And I'm just thinking now out loud, wouldn't this also create hatred towards Islam? That's a question now. Now, if we look further, during that time of the Song dynasty, there was also the Islamic architecture. Mosques were also built, and Islamic architecture was also prevalent. The next dynasty that comes now is the Ming dynasty. The Ming dynasty is, again, plays an important role, although in a different way than the Song dynasty for the Muslims. They continued to be influential around government cities and circles. 6 of Ming dynasty founder Zhu Yuanzhang's most trusted generals were Muslim. Okay, so we have to look into this one, that they continued playing an important role. But some things changed here. We are looking now into the 13th, 14th century, 15th century even. The army generals who were Muslims, they were the ones who also protected China, and they were the ones who won a decisive victory over the Mongols in Mongolia. That's a very important point here now for the Chinese, because there was always rivalry between the Chinese and the Mongols, as we saw before. Now, the Muslim generals, 6 of them, were the ones who helped the Chinese army and the Chinese to protect them from the invasion of the Mongols. People, as we all know, we are aware of the influence or the power of the Mongols, and we are aware of how much fear people had at that time for the Mongols. So that was definitely an important step for the Muslims to be accepted in China. They were the ones who ended the Mongol dream to reconquer China. Okay? So the Chinese owe the Muslims quite something in that way, if you look at it. Now, the Ming Dynasty now played a different role, as we said, to the dynasty before, although during the time of the Ming Dynasty, the Muslims helped the Chinese to keep the Mongols out. Still, immigration was restricted. Foreigners were looked upon in a different way from the Chinese, and there was more a policy of isolationism. Basically, they created China as an isolationist nation. The Muslims in China, who were descended from early immigration, began to assimilate by speaking Chinese dialects and by adopting Chinese names and culture. Mosque architecture began to follow traditional Chinese architecture, and in this era, sometimes considered the golden age of Islam in China, also saw Nanjing become an important center of Islamic study. Now, what does this mean? During that time, it is considered the golden age of Islam in China, but what is happening, the Muslims are more assimilating into Chinese society. Now, we're coming back to the first episode, assimilation, integration. We're talking about two different things. Assimilating into a society means becoming the same, becoming one with the society, losing actually your identity in many ways. Maybe assimilation is a strong word in that case, because still the mosques are still mosques, but they're becoming more Chinese, they're getting the Chinese character, which there's nothing wrong with, because Islam is fully, understands fully the need of people to assimilate into the culture, but it still has to remain a masjid. The prayer has to still be the Islamic prayer. So the Chinese, they went further, the Muslim Chinese. They even not only started speaking Chinese, where there's nothing wrong with, but they also adopted Chinese names and culture, which of course is a problem, because adopting Chinese names and cultures means you take away the Islamic names and you take away certain parts of the Muslim culture, which is different to certain parts of the Chinese culture. So that's what's happening now. And this is quite a dangerous move. Although, again, just to make this clear, the Ming policy and the Ming dynasty was quite tolerant towards the Muslims and towards Islam, still this, what we just discussed, was happening, that the Chinese basically become more assimilated. Now, last but not least, the Qing dynasty, which was from 1644 to 1911. So basically before the revolution, before the communists took over, they saw multiple revolts. And they were the ones basically trying to suppress revolts that were going on in the China of these 300 to 400 years that they were actually governing China. And they would not distinguish between Muslim or non-Muslim. They would just go against any revolt which was against the state, of course. And they did not pay attention to it being by Muslims or non-Muslims at all. Of course, in the end, we come to the point of China accepting the communist government, and the communists, as we know, did not want to see Islam, did not want to see any religion at all having any part, an important part in society. They considered it opium for the people. And several mosques were even destroyed or closed, and not only in China, but of course because we are in China, we're talking about that one. And copies of the Quran were destroyed, along with temples, churches, Buddhist centers, etc. Nowadays, alhamdulillah, in China, there is a kind of renewal of Islam, alhamdulillah. People come back to Islam. There are Chinese who have accepted Islam and are accepting Islam, mashallah. And if we're looking into this nation, I think I'm looking into this one with optimism, and I think there is a future for the Muslims and for Islam in China as well. Jazakumullahu khair. I would like to thank you. We've come to the end of this episode, and I hope to see you in the next one. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
We are the Muslim Ummah, and each day that goes by, the harder we try. In gratitude we pray to Allah. Chosen as part of the best of mankind, we spread the word of Islam. Every difficulty faced in our lives makes us realize that it's just part of Allah's plan. Feeling stronger, we take it in our stride. We are the Muslim Ummah, and each day that goes by, the harder we try. In gratitude we pray to Allah. Chosen as part of the best of mankind, we spread the word of Islam. Every difficulty faced in our life